Okay, question, quick poll. So we have around like 25 minutes to review, and we had planned some content about the first half of everything, which includes so reach router, like front end routing. It includes basic API calls and how to make and set up API endpoints, and then also how to query from databases, just like an overview of what we learned. And then we also have a little bit of material going over stuff from the socket lecture for today. So if we're thinking about like time and what to prioritize, raise your hand if you really want to go over like a broad overview of what we've done so far. Cool, okay. And raise your hand if you particularly want to go over sockets from today.
Okay.
That was like as many people, that was like the same number of people for each, so we'll do our best.
We could see what topics that people care more about. So on the poll, it seemed to be more about like overall client server model, APIs, and sockets. So I'm gonna just run through our timeline so far, everything we've done. So React, life cycles, states and props. Okay. All right.
Just raise your hand if you want to go over it.
Yeah. So then maybe writing your own APIs, endpoints, get and post. Okay.
Okay. Good.
And then middleware. Okay.
Okay.
Authentication. Seems like there's a mix of a lot of the heavy backend stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Databases. Over databases. Sockets. I think I already said sockets. You already raised your hand for sockets. Okay.
I'm getting less hand raised for sockets. So maybe we'll prioritize the core stuff that we went through already.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, cool. Let's do this. Okay. Can you like move that meeting space?
Can I hide it?
All right, so let's start off with basic client server models. How our website works is we have a bunch of React code, that's our front end, and we call that the client. Oh my gosh, I really wanted to make that a rectangle. Okay, and this is the client. So it's like all of the React code, which is stored on our browser. So that's like the React code for our entire website, and whatever's rendering at the time is based on like the reach router stuff, based on whatever's in the URL bar. Okay. You want to?
First one?
Huh? Yeah. I was just getting started.
Okay. So first thing we do is we do something like in our URL bar. Let's say we have our URL, and then we go to something like catbook.com. What we're going to be sent eventually is some type of mix of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but we're using something called the React library, which basically allows us to write front end more easily, and it allows us to basically manage our logic very well with state and props. But there is something within and we're basically structuring our app to take advantage of something called components, which we're building our app made out of.
And if you look in a React component, it's basically just, we write it as a function that takes in props, so some kind of input, and outputs HTML.
Yeah, so the highest level that we have in our React file is our app. And then we're gonna have different pages. First, we made something called the profile page, where we had the little cat happiness. Then we had the feed, where we're able to essentially make a full social media website. And then we also have something called chat. Chat, yeah, it's called chat. Chat, which basically utilize sockets to get lifetime data sending. And to navigate between every one of these, we use something called reach router. What reach router does basically takes this back end of catbook.com in the URL and says, depending on what this is, we're able to serve you either the profile page, the feed page, or the chatbook component, basically allowing us to have a multi-page website.
And so that's where the idea of mounting and dismounting comes in, and that's why we use effect, because our front end basically contains all of the React code that we have in our entire app, but then the router and all of that will tell us, okay, we only want to render one or some of those components. And so sometimes our components will be rendered and sometimes they won't, depending on what page we're on. Okay.
So we have app.js right here, you guys can see. we have our router and our ability to navigate between the 3 different pages that we have. So this is the start of our application.
Okay, cool. So now let's go on to client server. I'm going to erase, actually, I'll just make a new one. Then we also talked about the ability to send and receive HTTP requests between the client and the server being our backend, which we're running on localhost 3000. So in our client, we want to, if we need data from the server, we're going to send a request, like a GET request. And then on the server, we would set up an API endpoint to listen for that request and do something. Okay, so let's go into an example for this. For this example, we'll do the /API/comment endpoint. And so what we would want to do is that when we want to load all of the comments for a particular story in Catbook, we're going to send an HTTP GET request that looks a little bit like this. So GET is the method at the top. We're saying we want to send it to /API/comment. And then here it would also have like the localhost 3000 in backend. A bunch of other random metadata in the GET request. And then we would also have in our URL here some query parameters. So we'd have a question mark, and then we'll say parent equals 1. So the parent is just the ID of the parent story that we want to get the comments for. So all of the story that we want to get all the comments that go underneath that story. So this is what the GET request that we end up sending looks like. But Tony, where on earth from the front end are we going to send this GET request?
Yeah, so if you guys can remember a while ago that we want to actually load in all of our comments at once upon the first render of the card that we have. So we have our little story feed page. Within the feed page, we have lots of stories. And then within each card that contains a story, we have lots of comments. So we're going to have something called a use effect. So the use effect hook is something that says basically, whenever everything in this array updates, anything in this array updates, I'm going to call this function. This callback function. Now, since there's nothing in this array, it's going to essentially run the use effects callback function upon the first render of the page. So it's saying when I first load my page, I'm going to try to fetch all the comments from my backend.
So when we first load the card, mount the card component, and this will run. So this is one of the main places where you can make GET requests in your code, and that is in a use effect. So as soon as our component mounts, we want to load the information from the backend because we need that information to show the comments on the front end. Okay, and then let's show the backend where we receive that request. So this will be in api.js because that's where we have all of our API endpoints.
Comment. There it is.
Okay, so if you notice here, the comment that we're creating contains information that we get from the request object here. We have rec.user, and then we have, get comment, not post comment, sorry. We have information from rec.query. Now let's go back to our diagram and we can see where rec.query comes from. In the GET request, when we sent the GET request initially, we wanted to send some information in the request. We wanted to send, so here is where I have the query parameters denoted by the question mark. So this is the parent, the story that we want to get the comments under. And we sent that as part of the URL or part of the query in the GET request. And so then if we go back to our code, we can see that we sent the parent. So this is the syntax for how we use our GET function to send that parent as a query parameter. And then here is the syntax for how we receive that information on the backend. Okay, any questions on this front-end back-end connection for comment? Can I get a thumbs up to thumbs down on your understanding of this? Okay. Yes. Comment.find. We will get into that.
Yeah, so right after our front and backend connection, we're going to go into the database part where we have to go actually find the comment that we're looking for. So we'll go into that right after this section.
Okay, so now let's do another example. If we go back to our diagram. let's say this time we want to post a comment. It's still /API/comment, but there are no query parameters, because typically when we make post requests, we don't use query parameters. And then this method just becomes post instead of get. But then in addition, we also want to include a body for our post request, and that body is a JSON object that contains the information that we want to send. So our post request, for example, would have, what does it have? Like creator content or something?
Yeah, so it's a creator ID, a creator name, a parent, and the content body.
Okay, I'm just going to shorten that and just have a couple of things, but basically it is a JSON object with all the stuff in it. And so this is what our post request is going to look like for when we create a new comment. But where on earth on the front end do we actually send that post request? Tony, let's find it.
So if we go to new post input, if we recall, we have a reusable input text and a reusable submit button. And we're able to generalize that multiple times in our Catbook. The first time we used it was when we wanted to submit stories. We took this reusable input and submit button and we wrapped it in a function, in a component that had a function to submit a new story. The second time that we do it is down here in a new comments, new message, yeah, new comments, where we take this reusable new post input component and we wrap it in a component, another component, and we pass down an add comment function so that whenever you call the add comment function, you send a post request to the API.
So this earlier we talked about you can send GET requests or just HTTP requests in general from the front end in a use effect, so when the component mounts. But here we're saying, all right, now since the user, we want the user's input of pressing that submit button on the comment to trigger sending this post request. So that's why we give the sending the post request. We wrap it, we take the post request, we wrap it in this function, add comment, and then we give it as a callback function so that when the user presses the submit button, then our front end knows, okay, I have to call this callback function, I need to send a post request. Is everyone clear? How are we doing on that, sending a post request from the front end? Do we want to go over it a little bit more? Or if you want to go over it a little more, give me a thumbs down. If you're good, give me a thumbs up. Okay. Yeah. Do you have a question or do you want to just like go over it? Sure. Okay.
So more in depth, we have a reusable input text and a submit button, right? So usually something has to actually make the post request, and there are two main places where we do it. First, the first place that we do it is upon the first render of the page. So by pattern, that's usually the use effect that we see. The second place that we see it is when is asking you, when I click something, I want this things to happen. So if we see in our new post input component, this essentially what it has is it has a input text and an input button. In the input text, you're allowed to type whatever you want. And after you type whatever you want, you can hit the submit button. And when you hit the submit button, the onClick specifies what function you're going to call when you hit that submit button. And that is passed in as a prop. So we have a input text, we have a submit button, but what we're allowed to change is what is happening the moment you hit that button.
And that's what we want to be different based on whether we're submitting a new comment or story or a message.
Yeah. So the onSubmit is a prop to this new post input components. Now, if we want to create a input text input button and that has the functionality to create comments, what we do is we wrap it in another component. In this component, we declare a function that does the actual posting of the comments. And we take that function and we shove it into the prop of new post input. So we have a reusable component with a variable function, with a variable onClick, and we wrap it around with a function that does the posting itself.
It's a little bit confusing because we define this function that says, okay, here's what I want to do if I want to add a comment. And then we pass that function in as a callback function to the new post input component. And then the new post input component takes that callback function and also passes it as a callback function to the button component for the HTML. And so basically now our button that we render on the page has the reference to this function to add a comment. And so when we click that button, then it knows, okay, I'm going to call this add comment method and it'll do whatever we say, which in this case is taking the text and Yes, taking the text and then making a post request to create a new comment.
Is that more clear?
Yes.
Why do we have props on props? Props on. Why have-
So I think this is JavaScript shortcut notation for staff correct me if I'm wrong. It's saying that first I'm gonna check if this function exists at all. Because I don't always manually pass in the prop. So first I check if this function actually exists, and then if it exists, I'm actually going to run the function. Sorry. Okay, bet. Yeah, so there are a couple of JavaScript shortcuts that exist here and there, and this is just one of them.
Okay, cool. So now let's go into the back end for this post request and see what's going on. So you'll notice here in the back end, so we just showed on the front end in newpostinput.js, where we sending a post request to create a new comment anytime we hit that submit button. So that's how that's where it's in a callback function. But now on the back end, we have some information that we're getting from the request object. We have this rec.user thing, and then we have this rec.body thing. So the rec.user was something that we talked about in the authentication lecture. I won't dive into how exactly that gets populated, but basically rec.user just contains the information about the user who's currently logged in. But then rec.body comes from, if we go back to our diagram, remember how in the post request we said we're going to have a body in our request that has all of the information that we want to give the backend about the comment that we're creating. And then if we go back to our front end code where we're sending the post request, we can see where?
Right here, right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can see constructing this request body. And then when we make the post request, we're taking that body and putting it as the body of the post request. So that's sending it in the body of the request to the backend. And then on the backend, we can access that by saying rec.body dot and then whatever the field names that we sent in the front end.
So, but the issue is that while running localhost 3000, the moment we hit refresh on the page, everything kind of disappears, right? Like we need a centralized place to put all these comments. We're able to send comments, we're able to fetch comments, but where are we actually storing it? So that brings us to the database portion of it. In the database portion, what we essentially have is, yeah, I'll take that. In the database portion, what we have is, how do you take this pencil out?
Oh my gosh.
In the database portion, so this is, and the server talks to the database here. And let's say that you want to find out to save a comment into the database. Well, we first have to find what a comment looks like. So there's something called a schema. In a schema, we're actually able to say, here is what I want each comment to look like. So in the code, if we go to, I think it's under models, comment.js, we see that we define a comment to have a creator ID, which is a string. We also have it as a creator name. And we also have a parent. And we also have some content. After we're able to have the skeleton, the schema for what the comment is supposed to look like, we go to where all of our API endpoints are written in API.js, and we import it right here. So const comment equals require model/comment.
Go back to the model real quick, the
Yeah.
comment model. On the code. So what this is doing, so all we do in this file is we define a schema for what we want a comment to look like. But if you notice on line 12, what we do is we take that schema and we compile it into a model. So basically, the model is just some fancy JavaScript stuff that allows you to interface with the collection in MongoDB of comments. So in MongoDB, do you have it pulled up?
The MongoDB?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
No. Okay. Well, basically, if you go into MongoDB, you can see that we have a collection of comments, and it'll just be a bunch of JavaScript objects that all follow that format. So we'll have a collection of comments, a collection of stories, and a collection of users, and whatever else we want to store in the database. And all of these are distinct from each other, but they're connected via, like, for example, the comment would have the ID of the story that it's attached to.
Yeah, so once you have this model that is able to have some type of base schema, knowing what a comment looks like, and the model is able to interface with the database, we are now able to do various things in our code, such as comment the model dot find, your question, where we're able to query the database and find comments that fit some type of query, such as we can find all of the comments that say, I want all the comments with this one parent. I'm also able to use this comment model to save new comments to our database using comment.save.
So those are the two main things you're going to want to do. So it's the backend, the API that interfaces with the database, and we use these models in order to do so. So you can find all of the things in the database with certain criteria, or you can save new things to the database. Okay. Thumbs up on where we are so far, to thumbs down. Any questions?
All right,
Cool.
so
Okay.
moving on from databases.
Yes. Of course. Okay. The question was, what's the difference between rec.query and rec.body? So if we can go back to our thing in the, can we go back to the iPad? Okay. So an HTTP request has a bunch of parts. It'll have the method, for example, get. It'll have like where we're going, localhost 3000, for example. And then it'll have the root. And if we have a query, typically get requests will have query parameters and post requests will have body parameters. So both get and post like want to pass information from the front end to back end through the request, but they do it in slightly different ways. So if we have a parameter that's parent and then some number, and we have that as a query parameter, then in the HTTP request, it'll show up like this: question mark, parent equals 1, or whatever it is. And then there will be no body, it'll be an empty body. Whereas if we have it as a post request, then by convention, there will be nothing in the URL bar here, but there will be information here. And this doesn't show up in the URL, but if you look at the like inspect the request itself, you'll see that there are fields inside the body of the request.
Yeah, so basically rec.query, get request, rec.body, post request.
And when we send them from the front end, because of the like wrapper functions that the staff wrote, it'll look the same, whether you put in an inquiry or body. But under the hood, these requests will look different. Are we? Yes, okay. Are we just gonna pass it off to Michael? Or do we want to go?
Michael, do you still want to go over your last few parts of the workshop?
Honestly,
Okay. I think review might be okay.
Let's do high level. Okay, so we're going back to moving on to review some of the stuff from the sockets workshop. This is our componentry for the sockets workshop. So we had app, and then we had Chatbook, and then Chatbook had some subcomponents of chat list, single user on the right. So the chat list was, if our Chatbook looks like this, then we had our chat on the right with like the people that you can chat with. And so the chat list was here, and then the single user was just one of these guys. And then on the right-hand side, we had the chat, which just had like all these messages, and then a place where you can type in a new message and hit submit. Okay, so that's a rundown of the componentry. And now we're going to talk about how we do things with sockets.
Yeah, so if we recall, the problem is that when you're trying to create a chat, right? When someone else posts a new message, we have no way of obtaining it. Because in all of our paradigm is that the front end sends out a get request and it sends out a post request. And the server on the other side is listening with API endpoints. When the API receives something, it will send something to the clients. But if someone else sends the server a message, the server can't initiate any conversation. So the first problem we have is, how do we automatically update the chat with new messages?
Okay, So in order to update the chat with a new message, let's think about what has to happen. First, there has to be something that triggers a new message being sent. So like, we need to know when someone actually sends a new message. And the actual sending of a new message, I'm just gonna move to this diagram, happens in the single message component of the front end.
Okay, new message.
Oh, sorry, new message component. Oh, yeah, sorry. So this is where we first realize that, okay, someone wants to send a new message. So first, we do this. And then what happens in that is we send a post request to the slash message endpoint to say, okay, I want to post a new message. So this is going to be a post request. Let's call it step 2 post request. Okay. And then when we receive a post request on the side of the server, we need to save that message to the database. But then we also need to let all of the other clients know, this one included, that we have a new message. So then we're going to emit a socket event from the server to our front end. Now question, where do we want to send this socket event to? Where do we want to be listening for the socket event on the front end?
So all of our logic is usually contained in a very high level component. And for this one, it's going to be in, I think, Chatbook.
Yes, Chatbook. So in Chatbook, we say socket.on and we set up a socket that listens for a message event. So Tony's going to show you that in the code, and I wrote it on our diagram. Here. So inside a use effect, we listen for a message socket events. Let's go back to the diagram, and then step 3 is that this post API endpoint sends a socket event to the client that's listening for it. So this is a message socket event, and it'll contain the information about the message. And then just step 4 is that the client has to update the front end based on the new message that it receives.
Now notice that everything is so far pretty normal in our original paradigm of like the client sending something and the API responding. But in this one specific case, using sockets, because all the clients have listeners, the server is allowed to send messages to all of the clients. So not only will new messages be updated in client 1, but it'll also send it to client 2 as well.
Okay. So now let's, oops. Oh my gosh. Don't mind me. Okay. Now let's move on to the second thing that we need to do with sockets, and that is to automatically update the chat list when new users come online. So remember on the left-hand side, we had all of the chats that we could click on and people we could chat with. And so we want that to have everyone who's currently online. And so we want to do that in real time as well. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, Tony, when does someone come online?
Well, I guess they have to have an account. So maybe it's when they log in, maybe from the moment they log in from the app.js file.
Ah, I see. So interestingly enough, we want to create this, we want to change everyone else's chat list when someone logs in.
Yeah.
When someone sets up. Okay. So in app.js, first someone logs in. And then what happens?
Well, after that, the client actually saves it and adds a user.
Ah, so we make a post request to init socket. Can we go back to the diagram? All right, so first, one client logs in, and then they make a post request to this init socket API endpoint that we set up. And so that's saying, hey, I'm logged in, this is my socket ID. And so then what the server will do is it'll add this user to the mapping of, okay, this user ID corresponds to this open socket. So update mapping. And that will become important later when we add, I can't spell update, when we add DMs. Okay, and then what happens next is the server has to let the other clients know that a new user has come online. And so where are we going to be listening on the client for that socket event?
think this is also in Chatbook. So there is a socket on active users.
And we put it in Chatbook. We listened for the socket event in Chatbook because Chatbook is where we store the state with all of the active users. Okay, so back to the diagram. After the server updates the mapping, then it's going to send the socket event to the clients who are listening from the Chatbook component for active users. So we have this client here, and then another client also is listening for the active user socket event. And so then this post endpoint is going to send this socket event to both of these guys. And then, as usual, the last step is just for the clients to update their front end accordingly. And that is about time.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, no, we'll leave Michael's recording to go over the last part, support for DMs. And so all that involves is just the server not necessarily emitting to everyone, but only to the people for whom that message is relevant.
Yeah, so that is basically the end of today and the end of almost Catbook. There's only Gamebook left. So congrats for making it so far. Yeah, so what are announcements for today?
I can screen share.